For nearly 800 years, a different world existed on the Iberian Peninsula. A world of mosques and palaces, of poetry written in Arabic, of orchards irrigated with wisdom brought from the desert, and of cities that shone with a light that amazed all of Europe. That world was called Al-Andalus. But how could something so grand vanish completely? How could a civilization that once rivaled Baghdad or Constantinople collapse entirely? What really happened that led, in 1492, to the triumphant entry of the Catholic monarchs into Granada as the Christian cross was raised above the Alhambra? What we're about to tell is not just a sequence of dates and conquests. It's the story of the end of a world. A complex world full of contrasts of light and shadow. A world that, although it no longer exists, still lives on, in our language, in our cities, in the way we see life. Because the fall of Al-Andalus wasn't a single event, nor just one war. It was a long process marked by mistakes, betrayals, battles, and also moments of splendor. It was a deeply human story, filled with ambition, fear, hope, and pain. On this journey, we'll see how a land that was once a beacon of culture broke apart into small rival kingdoms. How the Christian kings of the north seized every weakness. How empires from North Africa came to defend what remained. And how, in the end, Granada, the last jewel of Islam in Western Europe, was forced to surrender. It's a story that still speaks to us today, not to pass judgment, but to understand. Because to grasp the fall of Al-Andalus is also to understand a part of who we are. And today, right here, we're going to tell you that story. To understand the fall of Al-Andalus, we first have to grasp its greatness. For several centuries, this land was one of the brightest places in the known world. While much of Europe had muddy roads and dark nights, in Córdoba, the streets were paved and lit by lanterns. In its markets, several languages were spoken, and its libraries held thousands of books, far more than all of France combined. In the 10th century, under the Caliphate of Córdoba, Al-Andalus reached its peak. The great Abd al-Rahman III, who declared himself caliph in 929, not only consolidated political power, but made Córdoba the cultural and scientific capital of the West. There, medicine was practiced, the stars studied, poetry written, Greek, Roman, and Persian texts were translated, and all of this was shared with a passion for knowledge that is almost unimaginable to us today. The Mosque of Córdoba, with its forest of columns, was not only a religious center, but also a symbol of power, beauty, and civilization. And it was not alone. Other cities like Seville, Toledo, and Zaragoza also shone with their own light. Andalusi art, with its horseshoe arches, gardens with fountains, and Arabic inscriptions speaking of paradise, began to define the urban landscape of the peninsula. But Al-Andalus was not only luxury and culture, it was also a diverse, complex society. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived together, though not always on equal footing. There were moments of coexistence and also tensions. There were pacts and there were wars. Some Christians, the so-called Mozarabs, adopted the Arab way of life without abandoning their faith. Many Jews found protection under Islam at a time when they were persecuted elsewhere. And the Andalusi Muslims, both Arabs and Berbers, formed the political and military elite. During these centuries of splendor, Al-Andalus seemed unstoppable, a place where knowledge and sophistication walked hand in hand. But as often happens in history, behind every peak there is a decline. And although from the outside everything looked brilliant, cracks were beginning to form within. Uneven wealth distribution, tensions between Arabs and Berbers, the fragility of tribal alliances, and the personal interests of many rulers gradually weakened the foundations of the caliphate. And so, over the decades, what seemed eternal began to crumble. The fall of Al-Andalus, as we will see, did not start with a great battle. It began with a slow internal division, with small cracks that eventually broke everything apart. The splendor of Al-Andalus was not eternal. After the death of Almanzor, the great military leader who had kept the caliphate united through conquests and discipline, a process of unstoppable decay began. In 1031, the Caliphate of Córdoba officially disappeared. Central authority collapsed, and Al-Andalus fragmented into multiple independent kingdoms, the famous taifas. Each taifa was like a small country with its own ruler, court, army, and currency. Some were brilliant cultural centers, like the Taifa of Seville under Al-Mutamid, or Zaragoza, home to scholars and poets. But they were also caught in continuous rivalry with one another. Instead of uniting against the common enemy from the north, the taifas often fought each other out of jealousy, power struggles, or old grudges. And when they could no longer fight, they bought peace. The Christian kings of the north saw their opportunity. Castile, Leon, Aragon, Navarre, all began to advance, step by step, taking advantage of Andalusi disunity. They even started demanding an annual payment called a paria, a sort of tax to keep them at peace. For example, Alfonso VI of Castile, at the end of the 11th century, amassed a huge fortune simply by collecting tribute from the Muslim kingdoms. But the biggest blow came in 1085, when Toledo, a key city, former Visigothic capital, and symbolic center of power, fell into Christian hands. It was a political earthquake. The balance was breaking, and then the taifas took a risky step. They asked for help from across the strait. From North Africa came the Almoravids, tough Berber warriors, deeply religious, who did not understand the refined Andalusi way of life. They came to fight for Islam, but also to impose their vision of the world. When they saw the wealth, luxury, palaces, and poetry courts, they considered it decadence. The Almoravids defeated the Christians at the Battle of Sagrajas in 1086 and took control of many taifas. But with them came a time of tension. Their strict Islam did not please everyone, and when their power weakened, they were replaced by even more radical forces. The Almohads, also Berbers, but with an even stricter view of faith. Thus, Al-Andalus lived a paradox. The Andaluses themselves asked for help to survive, but with each foreign intervention, they lost more autonomy. The cities no longer ruled themselves. They were governed from Marrakesh, often with a heavy hand. Meanwhile, the Christian kingdoms continued to grow, increasingly organized, stronger, and more determined to advance southward. The Reconquista accelerated, and Al-Andalus, torn between internal factions, African rulers, and hostile northern kingdoms, began to lose ground. The splendor of yesteryear was already a distant memory. What came next was a long, slow, and painful retreat. While Al-Andalus fragmented and its rulers debated pacts, tributes, and internal disputes, the Christian kingdoms of the north were gaining strength. Castile, Aragon, Leon, and Navarre, which had struggled to resist for centuries, began to go on the offensive. With a larger population, better organization, and a faith that justified every step southward, the Christian kingdoms advanced decisively. One of the most symbolic moments was the conquest of Toledo in 1085 by Alfonso VI. It was not just a military victory. Toledo was the symbolic heart of ancient Visigothic Hispania, and its loss was a heavy blow to Islam in the peninsula. From that moment on, the pressure on Al-Andalus would only increase. During the 12th century, the Almohads took control of what remained of the Taifas kingdoms and imposed a new era of more centralized, more theocratic power. From their capital in Seville, transformed into a splendid center of art and science, the Almohads tried to stop the Christian advance, but reality was stubborn. Although they won some battles like Alarcos in 1195, their luck was about to change. Then came the great turning point, the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212. It was one of the most important battles of the entire medieval peninsula. The most powerful Christian kings joined forces. Alfonso VIII of Castile, Pedro II of Aragon, and Sancho VII of Navarre. Opposing them, the Almohad Caliph al-Nasir gathered a large army. They met in the Sierra Morena, and there the fate of Al-Andalus was decided. The Almohad troops were completely defeated, and their power collapsed soon after. It was as if a door had been opened. From that moment on, the Christians advanced without restraint. In just a few decades, Cordoba was conquered by Ferdinand III in 1236. Then fell Jaén, followed by Seville in 1248, and gradually all the great cities of the Guadalquivir Valley. Muslim fortresses fell one after another, territories contracted, and Muslims who did not flee had to accept new pacts or become mudejars, that is, live under Christian rule while keeping their religion, though not always under fair conditions. And then, when it seemed all was lost, a last refuge emerged. In the southeastern corner of the peninsula, among mountains and fertile valleys, the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada was formed. A final Muslim stronghold, surrounded by enemies but still standing. A small kingdom that managed to survive, against all odds, for nearly 2.5 centuries. Granada resisted with cunning, diplomacy, and money. It paid tribute to Castile, made pacts with this and that side, and benefited from divisions among the Christians. It was a kingdom of precarious balances, but also great beauty. There the Alhambra would be built, a jewel that still takes our breath away today. But the pressure kept mounting, and while Granada tried to keep the Andalusi spirit alive, to the north, the Catholic monarchs were already preparing the final blow. After the defeat at Las Navas de Tolosa and the fall of the great Andalusi cities, Islam on the peninsula was reduced to a single corner, the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada. Founded in 1238 by Muhammad I, it was a small jewel that survived surrounded by the growing Christian power. It was nestled between mountains, protected by the rugged geography and the political cunning of its rulers. For over 2 centuries, Granada was a kingdom of unstable balance. It paid tribute to the King of Castile, but maintained its independence. It played with alliances, sometimes even participating in wars between Christians. It was a kind of diplomatic pawn, but also an extraordinary cultural and artistic center. Despite its precarious situation, Granada shone. It was during this time that the Alhambra was built, not just a simple defensive castle, but a dreamlike palace, a true poem carved in stone. Its walls speak of a world that still believed in beauty, harmony, and the mathematical perfection of Islamic art. While the world changed around them, the Nasrids tried to preserve something that already seemed to belong to the past. But Granada was not immune to internal problems. Power struggles, court intrigues, and conflicts between family clans undermined its stability. There were civil wars, overthrows, betrayals. One of the most critical moments came in the second half of the 15th century, when an internal war broke out between Emir Muli Hassin, his son Boabdil, and his brother El-Zagal. While they fought over the throne, to the north, Castile and Aragon united in a marriage that would forever change the history of Spain. Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, known as the Catholic Monarchs, saw the opportunity. With the backing of Rome, the religious fervor of the time, and the desire for unity under a single faith, they decided to end the last Muslim stronghold on the peninsula. But it was neither a quick nor an easy campaign. The War of Granada began in 1482 and lasted for 10 long years. It was a conflict of sieges, not large battles. The Christian troops, well organized and funded, took fortress after fortress, valley after valley. With every step, the roads filled with Muslim refugees fleeing south. The population suffered hunger, fear, and uncertainty. Meanwhile, inside the Nasrid Kingdom, Boabdil tried to resist, but internal divisions and Christian military superiority made defeat inevitable. The Granadans lived between fear of the enemy and distrust of their own rulers. They knew the end was near, but no one could say when or how. The resistance was tenacious. Some fortresses like Loja and Alhambra fought fiercely. But the Castilian machinery did not stop. Over time, even the inhabitants of Granada began to resign themselves. The siege was closing in. The city, a jewel nestled in the mountains, became isolated. Finally, in November 1491, Boabdil signed the Capitulations of Santa Fe, an agreement by which he surrendered Granada in exchange for guarantees for the Muslim population. Respect for their customs, religion, and property was promised. A dignified deal, at least on paper. And so, on January 2nd, 1492, the Catholic monarchs entered the city in triumph. Boabdil, with tears in his eyes, handed over the keys to the Alhambra. It is said that, as he looked at his city for the last time from a hill, his mother told him, "Cry like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." With that surrender, 8 centuries of Islamic presence on the Iberian Peninsula came to an end. An entire world disappeared, and another, very different, began. The surrender of Granada in 1492 was not just the end of a kingdom, but the beginning of a new era, full of promises and betrayals. That January day, the Catholic monarchs entered the city with solemnity. There was no looting, no immediate reprisals. The pact was honored. The Muslims would keep their homes, their lands, their mosques, their language, their religion. Everything would remain apparently as it was. But it soon became clear that those promises had an expiration date. At first, the policy was one of supervised coexistence. Representatives were appointed to protect the rights of the Muslims, now called mudajar. But over time, the pressure to convert to Christianity increased. Tolerance turned into suspicion, and suspicion into persecution. In 1499, barely 7 years after the surrender, the first uprisings over forced conversions began. Muslims were forced to choose between baptism or exile. Many, wanting to go after their homes and way of life, accepted baptism. But they did so superficially, without abandoning their customs, language, or rites. These new Christians were called Moriscos. And here begins a sad and complex story, that of the Moriscos. People caught between two worlds, two cultures, caught between the distrust of some and the repression of others. Although officially Christians, they were constantly watched. The Inquisition suspected they secretly practiced Islam, and in many cases they were right. How do you abandon a faith inherited through generations overnight? In Andalusian towns and cities, they tried to keep the memory of Al-Andalus alive. People spoke softly, cooked traditional dishes, prayed in secret, but the social climate grew increasingly suffocating. Any suspicion could lead to an inquisitorial trial. Prisons filled up, books were burned, mosques were destroyed. The cultural legacy of centuries was lost. The Catholic monarchs, by uniting the peninsula under one crown, also wanted one faith. For them, political unity meant religious unity. That's why, in that same year of 1492, they also expelled the Jews, many of whom had lived for centuries in Andalusian lands. It was a symbolic year, full of endings and beginnings: the fall of Granada, the expulsion of the Jews, and the discovery of America. For the Moriscos, the situation worsened with each generation. Some integrated. Many others were marginalized, persecuted, or punished for not speaking proper Castilian, for dressing differently, for keeping Arabic names. In 1568, under the reign of Philip II, a great rebellion broke out in the Alpujarras, the last desperate cry of a people who knew they were doomed. The repression was brutal. Finally, in 1609, Philip III signed the definitive expulsion of the Moriscos. Nearly 300,000 people were forced to leave their homes, fields, and lands. Many died along the way. Others scattered across North Africa. It was the final act of a story that had lasted nearly 800 years. With them disappeared the last of Al-Andalus. No more Muslims, no active mosques, no living Arab culture remained on the peninsula. Only ruins, scattered words, faded traditions. And of course, the stones of the Alhambra, silent witnesses to a world that no longer exists. But did it really disappear completely? Al-Andalus disappeared as a political entity. Its kingdoms collapsed, its religion was banned, its people expelled or absorbed. But its footprint, that was not erased. Because there are traces that cannot be seen, but they can be felt. They are in language, in music, in cooking, in the walls that still stand in our cities. Every time we say words like olive, sugar, pillow, or ojala, we are pronouncing fragments of that world. When we walk through the narrow streets of Cordoba, when we climb the Alhambra, when we contemplate the Mudejar art in a church in Toledo, or a roof in Teruel, we are touching the soul of Al-Andalus, even though centuries have passed. For almost 800 years, Islam was part of the history of Spain, not as a parenthesis, but as another layer of its identity. There were wars, yes, but there was also coexistence, exchanges, and shared wonders. It was a complex period, full of lights and shadows, of splendor and violence, as are almost all human histories. Perhaps Al-Andalus did not fall completely. Perhaps it simply changed its form, because cultures do not disappear completely. They are transformed, they mix, they resist in memory. And every time we look back, with curiosity and without prejudice, we help them not to die completely.